The summer of 1943 blazed across central Texas like the devil himself had claimed the weather. Temperatures soared beyond 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and the dust rolled in sheets across the plains, stirred up by the parched wind. Cicadas shrieked from the trees. The air carried the scent of mesquite, diesel, and something else. Smoke. Heavy hickory smoke. Camp Hearn lay buried in that heat like a thorn in the side of the prairie. A prisoner of war camp hastily erected by the United States Army to contain the overflow of captured German soldiers, mostly from the North African front. Over 3,000 men in uniform, many from the Africa Corps, filled the barracks. Some had fought in Tunisia, others in Libya, a few in Italy. Some had seen death. All had met defeat. But the war hadn't truly ended for them. Inside those barbed wire fences, another conflict simmered. A silent war of ideology, loyalty, and the mind. The Americans didn't fully realize it yet, but among those prisoners, a shadow command still functioned. Die-hard Nazi loyalists, men who refused surrender even after capture, enforced discipline with fists and whispers. Those who questioned the Reich were branded traitors. In some camps, men were beaten. In others, found dead in the showers. That was the world Corporal Jack Greer walked into. No one expected much from him. He was a cook, a ranch hand before the war. Raised near Abilene, he rode horses, smoked too much, talked slow, and wore a broad-brimmed hat that even generals didn't bother asking him to remove. His job was simple: cook meals for the American guards stationed at Camp Hearn. That was it. Greer wasn't trained in psychological warfare. He wasn't an intelligence officer. He wasn't even particularly political. Just a Texan with faith in two things: that good food could solve most problems, and that respect couldn't be demanded, only earned. But what he did, something so plain, so absurdly Texan, would become one of the most unexpected psychological victories of the Second World War. It began with brisket. Greer despised army rations, powdered eggs, canned meat, dull and colorless. So when he arrived at Camp Hearn, he did what any self-respecting cowboy would. He built a smoker out of an old oil drum, set up a fire pit with mesquite wood, and started cooking real food, slow, low, and proud. He'd rise before sunrise, toss a 20-pound slab of beef on the grate, coat it with cracked pepper and salt, and let the fire do the talking. It wasn't fancy. It was Texas. The guards loved it. But someone else noticed, too. The smoke drifted over the wire, curling into the compound where German prisoners went about their routines. At first, they wrinkled their noses. Some sneered, others ignored it. But after a few days, the smell got to them. Hunger, memory, curiosity, whatever it was. The smoke seeped through the strict order of the camp like water through rock. Then, on a blistering July morning, as the smoke rose and the sun beat down, something happened no one anticipated. A group of German prisoners approached the fence. Not threateningly, not suspiciously, just watching, squinting through the heat, uniforms sagging on weary bodies. One, a man in his 30s with sharp cheekbones and eyes like steel, called out in broken English, "What is that?" Greer didn't miss a beat. Wiping sweat from his brow, he flipped the brisket and replied in worse German, "Texas barbecue. You want some?" That small, ridiculous moment, so far from any military manual, sparked a quiet revolution inside Camp Hearn. Within weeks, the balance of power shifted. The Nazi loyalists lost their grip. Prisoners began volunteering for work. Morale changed. Trust grew. All because one cowboy knew how to smoke meat. What followed never appeared in official reports. But for the men inside those fences, it was the moment enemies began turning into something else entirely. The real war inside Camp Hearn had begun long before Greer ever lit his first fire. By 1943, the United States had captured over 400,000 German soldiers. With the Atlantic convoys secure and North Africa winding down, Thousands were shipped across the ocean and quietly placed in remote camps like Herne, far from the front, far from thought. But behind the wire, something dangerous festered. The Geneva Convention ensured that prisoners were fed, housed, and shielded from mistreatment. The U.S. followed those rules strictly, perhaps even too well. German prisoners ate better than many American civilians living under rationing. They had access to books, sports, music, even classes, and yet many POWs didn't feel like captives. They felt like soldiers on pause. Their minds were still in Berlin, with Hitler, with honor. Some were indoctrinated, others simply loyal. Most still believed the Nazi propaganda that had shaped them. Inside the camps, informal hierarchies took root quickly. Party members and former officers placed themselves as leaders among the rest. They ran roll calls, enforced order, and spread ideology like infection. To the guards, it looked like discipline, but beneath the surface, it was fear. Prisoners who questioned the Reich or cooperated with Americans were branded traitors. Some were beaten, others disappeared. At Camp Herne, the worst was yet to come, but the warning signs were there. Whispers in the barracks, posture too stiff when a certain officer passed. The military was slow to react. These were prisoners, not fighters. What harm could they do? But a few officers suspected the truth. The battle wasn't for bodies, but for minds. The War Department quietly launched a new campaign. Not propaganda, but re-education. They called it the intellectual rehabilitation of the German prisoner. It sounded noble, but no one truly knew how to achieve it. They tried lectures, film reels, lessons on democracy. Most efforts fell flat, dismissed as enemy lies. In that tense atmosphere, the arrival of Corporal Greer and his ridiculous barbecue pit should have meant nothing. And yet, that was exactly why it worked. Greer wasn't there to lecture. He wasn't there to convert. He didn't care if they admired Roosevelt or believed in the Constitution. He just made brisket and shared it. That simple act, voluntary, generous, human, did something no speech ever could. It planted doubt. If Americans were monsters, why did they cook like this? If they were evil, why did Greer smile and serve seconds? Why didn't he mock them? Why did his food taste like home but better? The barbecue became a subversive symbol, not of power, but of peace. And slowly, the prisoners began to change. Not because they were forced, but because they wanted to understand the man behind the smoke. The guards noticed it first. Fewer fights in the barracks, more volunteers for cleanup duty, laughter. Some even tried speaking English, asking about recipes about Texas, about the world beyond Hitler. The battle lines didn't collapse all at once, but they cracked, and through those cracks, something radical began to seep in. Curiosity. And that, more than anything, is what the Nazi loyalists feared most. Smoked brisket and broken ideologies. Greer's secret weapon. There was no plan, no blueprint, no secret briefing from Army intelligence. Jack Greer was just doing what he'd done back home on Saturdays after branding season. Fire up a smoker, crack open a soda, and feed whoever showed up hungry. But inside a prisoner of war camp in Texas, that ordinary habit began dismantling an extraordinary ideology. It started with one meal, a slice of brisket handed through the fence on a paper plate. The prisoner who took it, a former Wehrmacht mechanic from Cologne, hesitated before the first bite. He smelled it, touched it, and then cautiously ate it. He came back the next day. Soon others followed. Not all at once, not loudly, just a few at a time. They'd come near the fence under the pretense of stretching or sweeping or hauling crates. And every time Greer was there, he greeted them with the same lazy draw and the same offer. "You hungry, friend?" It wasn't charity. It wasn't manipulation. It was just food offered without strings. It was just food offered without strings. But that's what made it dangerous to the Nazi yards. Inside the barracks, panic began to spread among the ideological enforcers. They couldn't stop the food, not without revealing their fear of it. They couldn't forbid men from eating. It would look petty. So instead, they began whispering rumors. The Americans are drugging the meat. They're trying to make you forget your homeland. This is how they'll break you. But by then, it was too late. The brisket had already worked its magic. Not just on stomachs, but on stories. Because Greer didn't just serve food. He served conversation. Between slices of smoked beef and spoonfuls of beans, he told tales. Not lectures, not speeches, just stories about growing up during the Dust Bowl, about fixing fences at midnight, about a German neighbor named France who taught him how to ride a mule when he was 12, about the black cook who taught him how to make cornbread fluffy without milk. And the prisoners listened. They'd never heard Americans speak this way. Not from a podium, not through propaganda. Just as people. Ordinary, decent people with families, hardships, humor, and above all, humanity. Some of the younger German soldiers started asking questions. Is it true Americans hate us? Do you have Jews in your town? Why don't your officers yell at you? And Greer would answer straight-faced, never evasive. Hate you. Hell, I don't even know you yet. Yeah, we got Jews. Good folks. One owns the bakery. Makes a peach cobbler so good you'll cry. My officers, they yell if I burn the beans. That's fair. The answers landed harder than bullets because they weren't crafted. They weren't part of a strategy. They were real. One morning, a German corporal, previously known as a hardliner, showed up early at the fence. Greer asked if he wanted coffee. The corporal nodded, took the cup, and then asked softly, "Are you allowed to be kind to us?" Greer laughed. "Ain't never asked." That line, innocent as it was, spread like wildfire through the camp. By late August, that trickle of curious prisoners had become a wave. The barbecue had become a ritual. Once a week on Sundays, Greer would cook for the guards, but now he'd make enough to accidentally have leftovers. The prisoners knew, the guards knew, and nobody stopped it because something remarkable was happening. Prisoners started volunteering for work details, not because they had to, but because they wanted to be near the cookhouse. They cleaned stables, stacked supplies, sorted mail. They whistled while they worked. They joked. They shared recipes from back home. The Common of Camp Hearn wrote a memo to Washington noting a sharp increase in morale, productivity, and cooperation among PS, apparently linked to improved informal rapport with mess personnel. He didn't name Greer. He didn't have to. Everyone knew, but not everyone was happy. The Nazi inner circle inside the camp, small but vicious, began plotting. They branded the volunteer workers as traitors. They scrolled slurs on bunk walls. They spread pamphlets. In one incident, a prisoner was beaten for refusing to stand during a secret salute. That was the moment things shifted permanently. The targeted prisoner, bruised but defiant, walked to the commandant's office the next day and asked to be transferred to the labor barracks. He ended his request with 4 words: "I'd rather eat brisket." The backlash failed. The pro-Nazi faction collapsed. Their influence burned away, not by force, but by fire. Fire from a Texas smoker, tended by a cowboy who never read a psychological manual, but understood one eternal truth. You can't hate someone whose food you love. How Camp Hearn became the most cooperative pea site in America. By the fall of 1943, something extraordinary had taken root behind the fences of Camp Hearn. This wasn't just about barbecue anymore. The German prisoners were showing up for work early. They volunteered for kitchen duty, warehouse inventory, even trash disposal. Not under threat, not out of desperation, but willingly, cheerfully, even officially. It made no sense. These were enemy combatants trained and conditioned to resist Allied authority. And yet inside Hearn, order emerged from camaraderie, not coercion. Cooperation replaced command. When the War Department reviewed data from multiple sites, Hearn stood out. While other camps dealt with secret Nazi tribunals, sabotage, even murder, Hearn reported a sharp drop in incidents. Productivity was up. Medical reports were down. Prisoners requested English books. They asked for American newspapers. Some even requested to stay in the U.S. after the war. Washington took notice. They sent observers to the camp to investigate. The assumption was that some secret program had been implemented, some classified morale experiment or psychological manipulation. What they found instead was a cowboy in a greased apron, tending a smoking pit and chatting in broken German while handing out ribs. One visiting officer reportedly asked Greer, "What's your method?" Greer just shrugged and said, "I don't serve politics. I serve meat." That philosophy had become contagious. Prisoners began replicating the behavior they observed. They formed music groups, offered language lessons. One group of former tank operators even built a model of a panzer out of scrap wood and painted it red, white, and blue. This wasn't brainwashing. This was reintegration, organic and unexpected. It was the quiet undoing of years of militarized thinking, not by propaganda films or re-education lectures, but by social osmosis. It baffled the command staff. It thrilled the intelligence community. And it terrified the remaining Nazi loyalists. But their numbers were dwindling. By late October, they were a marginalized group, viewed not as leaders, but as bitter relics. The younger prisoners openly mocked their slogans. One joke made its rounds among the bunks. How do you make a Nazi cry? Give him a plate of beans and tell him it's freedom. Greer never pushed anyone to change. That was his strength. He simply kept showing up every week, every smoke-filled morning. He cooked, talked, and listened. Sometimes he played music on a beat-up harmonica. Sometimes he taught prisoners how to use Texas dry rubs. And slowly, those who had once marched under swastikas began asking about baseball. A sergeant from Dresden became obsessed with Hank Williams records. A former Luftwaffe pilot tried Coca-Cola for the first time and declared it better than schnapps. A former SS translator, once stone-faced and silent, began translating American folk songs for his barracks. None of this happened with orders. It happened around the fire pit. Greer never kept notes. He wasn't trying to make history. But he did tell a friend years later, "If you want a man to change, first you got to feed him something he's never tasted, and then make sure he knows it came from someone who sees him as a man, not an enemy." It wasn't long before word of Camp Hearn's transformation reached German prisoners in other camps. Some tried to request transfers. Others wrote letters home describing what they'd seen. One such letter, intercepted by Army censors, read, "We were told America was a land of monsters. But today I cleaned out a barn with a black man and a Jew, and afterward a cowboy fed us meat so tender it fell apart." What kind of war is this? Even the guards changed. They began relaxing their posture, talking more with the prisoners. One GI admitted in a journal entry, "These guys aren't Nazis anymore. Not most of them. They're just people who got lost in something bigger than they could see." And all of it, every shift in mood, every break in doctrine, every crack in hate, traced back to something no military strategist had planned. A cook, a smoker, a meal shared across enemy lines. By the end of 1943, Camp Hearn was labeled by the War Department as a Model P facility, not for its security, but for its psychology. An internal memo referred to it as the ideal example of natural radicalization via cultural exposure and shared ritual. But the people in the camp didn't use such terms. They just called it Sunday barbecue when the smoke beat the swastika, the collapse of the Nazi underground. By early 1944, the last vestiges of Nazi control inside Camp Hearn were hanging on by-threads, and everyone could see it. The ideological enforcers once feared and respected among the prisoners had lost their grip. Their commands were ignored, their slogans mocked. The younger men no longer saluted them in secret. Some even rolled their eyes when they walked by. But like all cornered animals, the Dayards didn't go quietly. They saw the signs. They saw the prisoners joking with American guards. They saw men reading Mark Twain, tapping their boots to swing music, learning to play baseball in the yard. And they saw the brisket. Every week, that smoker puffed away like a locomotive of peace, pulling more and more prisoners out of fear and into curiosity. To the old guard, it was humiliating. To them, it wasn't just a meal. It was betrayal. So, they plotted one final act. A message had to be sent. A warning. Something to reassert their control. To punish those who had gone soft and remind the others of who they were. Their target was a young soldier named Emil Kraus. 22 years old from Stuttgart, Kraus had been a loyal soldier until he tasted brisket. He'd been among the first to volunteer for labor duty, to joke with the Americans, to ask questions that made the old officers see, and he made a fatal mistake. He brought Greer a hand-carved wooden spoon as a gift. One night in March, Kraus was ambushed in the latrine, beaten badly, left unconscious, face down in mud. The next morning, the camp changed. Words spread like lightning. Greer heard it before breakfast. The guards heard it before roll call. And this time the prisoners didn't stay quiet. They rallied around Kraus. They carried him to the infirmary. They told the guards what had happened. Names, details, everything. Within hours, 3 prisoners were placed in solitary confinement. More would follow. The Nazi underground was over, not broken by gunfire, but by public rejection from their own ranks. It wasn't an uprising, it was an exhale. That night, Greer stayed late by the smoker. He didn't say much, just stared into the fire, tongs in hand. One of the guards asked him if he was okay. He nodded. "I reckon the brisket ain't what changed him," he said. "It just gave them permission. That was it. Permission to ask questions. Permission to see themselves outside of the regime. Permission to be hungry for more than food." From that day on, Camp Hearn entered a new phase. The Nazi salutes disappeared entirely. The barracks began requesting American music and literature. Prisoners who once feared speaking out began openly condemning the Reich. And most striking of all, a group of German prisoners on their own initiative organized a Thanksgiving dinner in April. It was nowhere near the actual holiday, and they didn't fully understand the meaning. But they knew one thing. They were grateful. They prepared what they could from rations, potatoes, bread, canned vegetables, and they asked Greer if he would lend the fire. He didn't just lend it. He showed them how to run it. That Sunday, prisoners and guards ate side by side. No rifles, no shouts, just laughter, shared plates, and grease-stained napkins. Kraus, now recovered, raised a mug of weak coffee and said in English, "To the men who made us believe the war could end." Everyone knew who he meant. After that, no one dared revive the Nazi underground. Its power had dissolved, not from orders, but from irrelevance. And as for Greer, he never asked for recognition, never wrote a memoir, never gave an interview. But he did receive something else. One day, weeks later, he walked into the mess tent to find a bundle of letters stacked on his cot, handwritten, translated into English, from prisoners, from men who once called themselves enemies. They thanked him for the food. They thanked him for the dignity, and one of them, a former Nazi youth leader, wrote just 6 words. "You cooked the hate out of me." After the smoke, the men they became. The war, of course, went on. In Europe, the Allies pushed through France. The Soviets closed in from the east. And in April of 1945, Adolf Hitler, once seen by many in Camp Hearn as a demigod, took his own life in a Berlin bunker. But inside that camp in Texas, something deeper had already died months earlier. Belief. The belief in Nazi supremacy. The belief in total loyalty. The belief that being captured meant weakness. In its place, something else grew. By the time VE Day arrived, the men of Camp Hearn were already different. Some still held on to fragments of ideology. But for many, their experience in captivity, guided not by propaganda, but by one man's fire pit, had changed the way they saw the world. When repatriation began, hundreds of German PS boarded trains with mixed feelings. They were going home to a country in ruins, a country they barely recognized. But in their pockets, some carried small tokens, BBQ recipes scribbled on napkins, drawings of horses, American slang phrases they'd written down phonetically. One even took a piece of the smoker's chimney cap as a souvenir. Corporal Jack Greer never went to see them off. He didn't like goodbyes. Hess stayed behind the mess hall, cleaning up grease trays and muttering about overcooked beans. But the prisoners left messages carved into bunks, scribbled in letters. One note taped to the mesh hall door simply read, "You treated us like men, not monsters. We won't forget." And they didn't. Years later, when West Germany began rebuilding, several former Camp Herne prisoners wrote to American officials asking for permission to immigrate. Some succeeded. 2 opened restaurants. One opened a ranch-themed steakhouse in Hamburg and named it Jack's Fire. Another, Emil Kraus, the young man beaten by Nazi loyalists, became a school teacher in Dusseldorf. He included American civil rights in his curriculum and kept a photo of Greer in his desk drawer. When asked about it, he'd say, "That man gave me my second life. I only fought in the war. He ended it for me." Jack Greer, meanwhile, went back to Texas. He turned down a combination, turned down a promotion. Hess said no to an offer to train military chefs in morale-based strategy. He just went home, got a job fixing windmills, bought a new smoker. People asked him years later if he'd known what he was doing, if he'd planned it. He'd just smile and say, "I planned on feeding hungry men. Turns out that was enough." He never married, lived alone on a small ranch outside Abilene. But he was never really alone. Letters kept coming on birthdays, on Christmas, on anniversaries of VE Day, sometimes in English, sometimes in German. One letter from a former Africa Corps sergeant arrived in 1967 and read, "I used to salute a flag. Now I salute the man who taught me to sit down at the table instead." Greer died in 1981 quietly, without headlines or monuments. His legacy never vanished. In the early 2000s, a historian compiling a book about POW camps in America stumbled upon repeated mentions of the barbecue cowboy in veteran testimonies from both sides. He dug deeper, interviewing families, studying letters, uncovering memories. What he found wasn't a tale of war, but one of redemption. One fire pit, one man, 3,000 prisoners, and something indescribable that happened in the space between smoke and silence, when brisket conquered hatred. In a war defined by savagery, firestorms, and genocide, it's easy to forget that sometimes the most powerful weapon is compassion. Jack Greer didn't carry a rifle. He didn't speak fluent German. He didn't study enemy psychology or ideology. He simply stood by a smoker, tending the meat, inviting men taught to see him as subhuman, to sit near his fire. What happened in Camp Herne wasn't a miracle. It was something greater. It was intentional decency, the kind that rarely makes headlines, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into after-action reports, the kind that transforms hearts not through power, but through familiarity. Food is universal. Smoke softens defenses, and shared meals, especially across the divides of war, hatred, and fear, accomplish something that speeches and sanctions never can. They humanize. The Nazis trained men to strip others of humanity, to erase identity until only obedience and ideology remained. But one cowboy in Texas did the opposite. He reminded them of taste, of conversation, of sunlight, of laughter, of music. And in doing so, he reminded them of who they were. We like to think wars are won on battlefields. And often they are. But sometimes they're also won behind barbed wire, with tongs in hand and the scent of brisket drifting in the wind. We may never know how many lives Jack Greer changed, or how many Nazi sympathies he smoked away with every rack of ribs, but we know this: 3,000 prisoners left Camp Hearn different from how they entered. Not because someone shouted orders, but because someone shared a meal. Maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson worth remembering most. What surprised you most? That a cowboy could disarm Nazi ideology with a barbecue pit? That food, not force, broke the enemy's pride? Tell us in the comments. And if you believe history should be told through the human stories that shaped it, hit like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still thinks kindness is weakness. Because sometimes smoke doesn't just rise, it restores. Smoke doesn't just rise, it restores.